And live from Brussels, it's ZN Live. That's right. I'm very excited today. This is episode 371. I'm your host, Phil Weiss, ZN founder and CEO. And I have two fantastic guests, one co-anchor and a guest. Evie is joining us from the ZN office in Brussels near Place Flagey, where an event will take place soon that we will be talking about. She's an account manager and loves all things Coca-Cola and cosmetic. And we have Harold, who is joining us also from Brussels, I believe, and is, in fact, a very experienced consultant. We were discussing his 30-year career spanning communication, policy, consulting, various activities. He's even a teacher, a guest lecturer in Antwerp, and has a lot more experience. But one of the things that we discussed previously, and we're going to go back to today, is that he's one of the initiators of Beer and Politics in Brussels. This is an organization that came out of Spain. And we're going to be doing, he's organizing an event on democracy, which we are going to be talking about. But first, I want to go to one of the big topics that everybody is thinking about right now, which is the EU, since we're approaching the election cycle, which is a moment when the EU institutions have to kind of explain to people what they do and what they're for. And I was reading on LinkedIn, somebody saying, this is when the EU Parliament says, this is what the EU Parliament does. And then people says, this is what the Commission does. And it's like, wait a minute, like all this time, nobody knew, which kind of goes to my first question. I think a lot of people believe that the EU institutions are not doing a great job at explaining what they are and what they do. So what do you think about how well they're performing and what could they do to improve their performance?
I think thank you very much for the fantastic intro, Phil. I think that's a completely a topic that is close to many people's hearts. It's a topic that has been rehashed time and again. As you know, you've been in Brussels for decades, and we've been talking about this for decades. I still remember about 15 years ago when the Committee of the Regions first started a EuropeCom conference, and the whole idea is to get the institutions to start thinking about, how are the institutions reaching out to citizens and whether they're doing that correctly. And I still remember, because that was my annual event, and every time there was this call to get the president of the commission to attend it, so as to bring some presence and bring some determination to reaching out to citizens. And that was never accepted. And when we fast forward to this year, 2024 elections year, like you said, I think it's worth doing some stock taking, exactly how the EU, whether things have been done, or whether things could be improved. It would be great if we could talk about some of our milestones. To me, there are three milestones, if I may. The first thing is that when we look back at the 2016 Brexit referendum, I think that was a big learning experience. There would not have been Brexit if there were no social media platforms. That was what people start, think about, and they go like, okay. And in that sense, the EU social media outreach has failed then. It did not correct misconceptions about itself during Brexit. It did not reach out to its intended audience, so that people get to know about the works, and the functionings of the EU. And a big misconception, I feel, at that time, I was out of the commission already. Before that, I was in DG Communications. So the whole idea back then was that, okay, social media is only for young people. And when you look at the referendum, an overwhelming number of people were not young people, and they voted against staying within the EU, so for Brexit. So it just says that the EU or whoever's in charge of all the outreach should have been more aware of whatever that's developing at the communications realm. And to them, they kind of were always one step back, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And then you have things like the second. Please jump in if you want
No,
to.
go for it. Go for it.
I think the second milestone that we need to look at was the COVID-19 pandemic. I think EU policymakers were very much taken by surprise, for example, by how virulent online communications were taking place. In fact, a lot of national policymakers were as well. Like I think the number of conspiracy theories grew on the internet faster than the actual strains of COVID-19 variants. Here in Belgium, I mean, it had very real world impact, I would say. And here in Belgium, I remember there was a 15% increase in bleach incidents. So people drinking bleach, trying to get rid of the virus, and all because of social media. And recently, it was only until like in the middle of last year, I read a report that was produced by the EP think tank on the online communications, about COVID-19 and how the EU was dealing with it. And they found out that, oh wow, so most of these fake news and disinformation, these were taking place on WhatsApp and messengers. Again, the EU is one step behind. So we were focusing so much on social media, but people were moving on to other channels as well.
Yeah.
So if we look back, we were always one step, as in the EU was always one step behind. I find that this conversation, Phil, what we're doing here is so vital because you are at the forefront of communications. You're trying to help make it clearer for us here in the Brussels bubble. I mean, the third milestone is now, after Russia's attack of Ukraine, we look at very complex policy issues and also issues pertaining to strategic autonomy, issues pertaining to our energy transition, all of these. Would citizens understand this? It's not an easy sort of communication, but it was necessary. It is still necessary. And a lot of this information we've found is taking place due to Russian interference, Chinese interference. And with the elections coming up, I think the EU really needs to be very clear about how communication trends are just evolving so rapidly. They need to catch up. They need to be at the forefront as everybody else. That's what I think.
I think, no, a very good point, very interesting. And I just wanted to highlight that Gaia said, happy Friday and looking forward to the next edition of Beyond Politics. And we have Daniel saying, so nice to have Harold again on the live and excited about the event. Now, coming to your points, I think you make very, very good points. And when you were talking, I was thinking, as you mentioned, we've been involved in communication for over 25 years. And we were talking about two things. The first thing is you need to learn to communicate for the EU institutions. So forget about which channel. The first thing is to recognize that you have a responsibility to communicate, because if you don't, people don't understand what the hell you're doing. I mean, and this is from the Explainer article. It's like, how is it that you still have to tell people what these institutions do? And yes, they are complicated, but I think it was actually Dave Keating who published a post saying it's not that complicated and you shouldn't wait so long to explain it. And I think that's true. You can use metaphors, etc. But the first thing is institutions need to recognize they have to communicate. The second point is indeed the platform in which this happens is the internet. And, I've always said it's not about social media. It's about digital platforms that are interconnected. So you have social media, you have messenger apps, you have emails, you have websites, you have news groups. The question is, what tools can you use to get your message out there? And how can you make sure that everyone who has a story to tell is actively telling it? And I remember having this discussion before the previous election and even before that, where it was becoming more and more apparent that I think you have a real gap because of the culture, and it's kind of the elite/bureaucratic project of the EU. It was okay. It's the elites that know what to do. They sat in a room. They said, we want peace for Europe. We're going to build institutions to protect us against conflict, to build economic prosperity. And we don't really need to explain the details of this to the public. And I think that's kind of created a gap that grew and grew. And then somebody said, no, no, we need to do a bit of communication. So, okay, let's create a tender and let's make it really complicated and cumbersome. And a lot of these tenders have come up, and the parliament is always going to have their big awareness campaign, which is vote, etc. But the problem, and I think you rightly pointed out, is that the institutions tend to be one step behind, because what they produce is like 3 or 4 years thinking, past thinking, instead of saying, okay, we now need to move and be agile. We need to be agile, experimental. We need to allow all the commissioners and all the key people to really engage. We need to build communities, and we need to kind of really get our story out there to the influencers, to the people with profile, and to the national press each time. And there's one more thing I wanted to add, which is that we actually were involved in a campaign during Brexit, actually just before Brexit. And the idea was to try to communicate the catastrophic impact that Brexit might have on Europe and the UK. And this campaign, which had been developed, which I think was fantastic, was killed by David Cameron, who told his colleagues in Parliament, saying, please don't do this. It's only going to make things worse. And so I think that was a very interesting moment where people said, and I think the mindset was, we should not communicate because it might make things worse. And now I think we realize you need to communicate. Now, it doesn't mean it's just communication. You have to have a strategic plan, etc. So now my question to you is, how optimistic are you about this election? I mean, do you think any of this is going to change in a serious way? Because, I mean, the reality is, like, yeah, we're all talking about it, but are people going to start moving, other than producing more and more tenders and big campaigns, and they commission one nice video that they say, oh, it should be a viral video? Do you think things are going to change? Are you optimistic?
I think what is clear now is that individual policymakers are very aware of the importance of communications. They all have their own channels. They start to realize that for their own political career, managing your own channels and your own platforms gives you power over what is being said, and also giving you a direct outreach to citizens. I see that trend increasing more and more. There's even a lot more policymakers on TikTok. Whether that's a platform that we want to use or not, that's another discussion altogether. But however, like you said, the institutions themselves, they need to loosen up. They need to be more experimental, looking at the campaigns that have come up, like you said, from the parliament, for example, getting people to vote, or on the commission, for example, proclaiming how wonderful Erasmus is. Looking at the content that have been produced, I think that everything is so scripted and it's not well targeted, and a lot of work has to be done. Like you say, we don't just want to communicate for the sake of communicating it. We want to engage. We want to get the interest. We want to listen to other people. We want to talk about important issues that pertain to them. So all this needs to get into the heads of the institutions. The bureaucracy needs to understand that this is the only way to get citizens more engaged and more interested in the EU. Whether I'm optimistic or not, I think everybody has said that, this elections, we're going to swing to the extremes. Like swinging to the extremes is never good, because we will not be able to find consensus on a lot of things. But this is also a reflection of how divided our society is. And it's really time that institutions and policymakers and all of us within the Brussels bubble try to promote the work of the EU and try to make it as better known. The gatekeepers, however, I think I want to call them out. Those are the national governments and the national media. They too have an important role to play in relating the role of the EU to ordinary citizens. They need to back up, and we need to create an incentive for these people so that they realize that promoting the EU, promoting the work of the EU is actually good for Europe, not bad for Europe.
I love how, Harold, you started, like by kind of like mentioning TikTok briefly, and now you also use the term gatekeeping, which has been a huge trend, like on TikTok in the past months, especially, like that we don't gatekeep in this platform. I do agree with everything that you mentioned. I personally feel that, it's like coming from the Greek electoral cycle last year, and because I'm Greek, we saw a big shift in the communications, because I think the interesting part of the current Greek prime minister is that he leveraged TikTok because it's a platform that is very, like massively used by, like the younger, generation in Greece, to not create scripted videos and things, like that are kind of like plain and very, like strict and serious, but he used this video content to create behind the scene material and like explain, for example, what they do, like when they come in Brussels and like have like a committee with other countries, like and meet up, like with the European Commission people. So from that perspective, I think this kind of like gave like better insights to people and kind of like incentivized them also to kind of like have a say. So although we say, like TikTok in Brussels and, in the Brussels bubble is not maybe the best option, I feel like personally video content is going to be crucial for this electoral cycle. And I wanted to ask you, how do you see the future trends and the trends that we have identified for 2024, for example, affecting how the EU communicates about itself, especially during this electoral cycle?
I think obviously with the global advent of Gen AI last year, I think that is a trend that I think the institutions are very much aware of, especially when they first had to deal with it within the AI Act. But in a way that the EU really needs to now understand the impact of Gen AI on its communications. On the one hand, I think that it will solve many of its issues in communications, because communicating about the EU is very much a multi-stakeholder sort of dimension, sort of communications. Are we talking to specialists? Or are we talking to ordinary citizens? Are we talking to old people, young people? Are we talking to minorities? Are we talking to the middle class? It's just so multi-stakeholder and multi-dimensional. And it's not just because of different languages, but also because of different communications habits as well of different audiences. So Gen AI actually is able to deal with a lot of that differentiation. I just saw a video last night on TV that this person just shows that she's able to do by using Gen AI to have one message but relayed in 5 different languages. It's amazing. And when you can do that in your communications, when you're talking about the EU, imagine von der Leyen, like addressing in a very personal way an audience towards young people, each of them listening to in their own language, and right on the dot. Doesn't sound like it's like badly interpreted or translated, but very well done, coming out from her mouth. This is great. It's a personal address. So I feel that this is a fantastic and wonderful opportunity for the EU.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, looking back at how disinformation has come out from the COVID-19 pandemic, and also early on, like we mentioned just now during the Brexit referendum, it's a very real threat at the same time. So a lot of people tend already take things at face value. How do you prevent sort of Gen AI or AI being used not for good, but for bad when it comes to communications? I think that is a huge challenge ahead.
Yeah, I think you're right. But the answer, the first thing I would say is that we don't have a choice. The tools are going to be used. Okay, so it's not that you have the option to say it would be nice if we could stop the bad actors from doing it, because the bad actors are going to do it. So that's the starting point. The question is, the people who believe in democracy and who believe in a moderate kind of consensus or some kind of reasonable approach, how can they cut through the noise when the extremists are using polarizing content and channels the most effectively. And I think the point you made, Evie, about TikTok, and actually Daniel mentioned the usage of TikTok in the Italian election. And I think there was an article on Politico saying that the extremists were using TikTok most effectively. So we've seen a lot of that. And I think that, what the commission needs to understand is that using TikTok has nothing to do with whether or not you legislate against it. And I think you can say, look, now you need to use it. It's a tool. This is where young people go. If you think that there needs to be a ban, fine, have that discussion. But using it does not mean you're kind of endorsing it. And I think this is one of the big misconceptions is you have to use all the tools at your disposal, because if you don't, other people will. And if there is Gen AI being used to amplify disinformation, you need to figure out how you can reverse the use of these tools for your own purpose. And I think it goes back to the importance of communicators in the institutions being experimental and agile. There is no fixed answer. We don't know what the best tool is. I think, Evie, you rightly said that video is going to be important. I think using new tools. But at the end of the day, it's storytelling that we need to look for. So the real thing is that I think what the institutions and the individuals in the institutions need to do is to say, okay, this is why we need Europe. It's to travel. It's for stability. It's because of Ukraine. It's because of the economy. It's because of disease. You just need to bring it to stories of, big societal challenges we have and benefits that you have. Hey, you can work in a different country. You have Erasmus and all that. And I think we need to bring those simple stories in a very powerful, very effective way, and then multi messages that will resonate with different audiences, reach influencers. But the basic thing you need is a great deal of experimentation, because so what you need is to create more output, and not output that takes 6 months to approve, and you create one 30-second video like you're in 1995. I mean, it's like you need to create one video a day, and you need to have 15 different versions of that video, create 27 language versions if you can using AI, and then maybe adapt the landscape and the story. So I think my feeling, by the way, is that we're going to see a lot of move in that direction. So people will say, yes, we need to communicate, but it's going to feel like it's just 2 or 3 years older than it should be. Hopefully we'll see a few talented institutional players do some good work, but I still think there'll be a minority. And I think we'll still have the terrible kind of official releases and videos that when the minute you see it, you go like, oh my God, I can see how many feedback rounds this has gone through. There's no soul. I am bored. It's telling me a story nobody wants, but it's correct, but it is not passionate. It's not engaged. So I think what we need to do is to find the courageous people in the institutions who can say, I'm going to take a risk. I might get, somebody might reprimand me or fire me even for doing this, but at least I'm going to try. And you have to operate at the edge to do this. Gaia confirms that the usage of TikTok spread a lot among politicians in Italy. And we have several comments as well from Daniel saying, will we see any AI face swap candidate posters? I think we're going to see a hell of a lot of AI face swapping, whatever that means, during the election. And again, because the anti-European or the extremists will be playing with this, you just need to understand those tools and figure out how to do that. Now, talking about the election, we have a very exciting event coming up on the 17th of April. This is organized by Beer and Politics with some people who will be talking about the EU election. Now, tell us a bit in a nutshell, what is Beer and Politics and what will this event be about and why should people come?
So Beers and Politics is a worldwide movement that started about 7 or 8 years ago in Madrid. It started when a group of public affairs professionals were meeting up in a bar, and the conversation just grew bigger and bigger with the people at the bar So they made it a regular thing, and it spread throughout Spain, and from then on spread throughout the world. So in many cities in the world now, there's a BS in politics. It's a trademark movement. It's the only one. There are like spin-offs everywhere,
Wine and
which is also
politics,
good.
vodka and
Yeah,
politics.
exactly. Wine and politics, and if you don't like beers. So I've brought this one, Beers and Politics, to Brussels to focus specifically on EU affairs. And the idea is very much we need to democratize the discourse about EU affairs and EU policies and EU politics, which is the reason why I put it on the Meetup app. Apart from LinkedIn, make it public. It's free as a voluntary movement. So I cannot collect money from it. The idea is people come, they have a drink, and they would discuss. I would set a topic that day. There would be speaker or speakers, and it's not a boring speech like what we usually have in the Brussels bubble. There's no speeches allowed, no PowerPoints, and anybody can interrupt anybody else at any point of time. But it won't drag on and on. It lasts for at most 1 hour, after which people sort of like stay on, linger on for networking or for drinks. So the next one, we're going to organize it together with ZN. We're going to be at the ZN office on the 17th of April, and we're going to talk about the EU elections. So it's extremely timely. And the title of it is Are EU Policymakers Reaching Out to Citizens? It's very much what we've been talking about for the past half hour. And it is about how individual policymakers are making sure that, now with the elections coming up, like what you say, AV, reaching out on TikTok, people are trying to do that just to make sure that people understand what they're doing. Very much at the national level, but at the EU level, are we seeing more of that? Are people really understanding that they need to reach out to citizens, not just during election years, but also ordinarily? Are they able to achieve that, and how far have we come? So we have two speakers. I'm trying to get the third one. The first speaker is Valentin Dupuis. And the other one is Federico Tereni. And the third speaker is still to be confirmed. It will be moderated by me and also by a colleague of mine, Angela, who's working at the Commission.
Right. So that's very interesting. And so basically, yeah, you'll have the guests. I joined one of your events recently. People sitting around, having a beer or a glass of wine. Any drinks is allowed. Tea, coffee, water, and basically chatting and networking. And I think that's that's a very good format because it creates that discussion. I always believe that you want to connect the discussion in the room with the discussion online. And, I hope that we can get a bit of a follow-up maybe from this discussion to see what kind of questions we might get in the audience, and so that you can trigger that debate. But the thing that I want to say, and, I kind of feel like saying this in every election cycle, but it's to really ask the Commission to take a deep look at what is not working, to be honest about the issues they have. Because I think the problem is, because of the bureaucracy and the structure, it's often difficult to tell, your DG or whatever, this is just not going to work. And it's not about how much money you're throwing at the campaign. It's about the approach. You need to be just more experimental. You need to really work with people who know what they're doing, and you need to be able to change throughout the campaign. And I think that's missing. I hope, as I said, that we're going to see stuff. I know that there's some great communicators in the institutions. I know a lot of them, but often they're not able to bring their vision into practice because they're constrained, and great things get shot down. And then they can't start experimenting because it's not in the existing structure. And Evie, you wanted to mention something about meeting.
Yes, I wanted to ask Harold because I think that like the idea is brilliant, and I'm very happy like that this was brought to Brussels, in the sense that like, I mean, there is no better place for beers in politics, like, if you think about it. But I wanted to ask you, from your experience and your insights like along the years, how important do you think that these informal meetings are in fostering a better understanding among the public for like when it comes to political issues? Because I think it's a topic that like some people are interested, but some other kind of like avoid discussing because they might have like lack of knowledge. So how do you think like these informal meetings are kind of like helping to create a better, more inclusive, like discussion environment?
For sure. I mean, this what we're doing at BSA Politics is very small scale, but when you look at like how people are actually really involved, they really want to know more about politics, and that's the reason why people join. And also, I mean, you also want to avoid the scenario whereby, like recently you get trucks driven into into Brussels, and metro stops being set on fire. This is symptomatic, I feel, that the divide between politics and citizens, and we have to bridge that no matter how. Like you say, I mean, it's an informal meeting, and anybody can join. And to experience that, we've been in the bubble for some time now, and we're just like in it talking about it. And to have like a handful of people strolling in and asking very simple questions like, what's the difference between the European Council and the Council of the EU, for example? They have absolutely no idea. And these are very pertinent questions, and we're very happy to be able to answer those. Of course, we're just answering one or two people, but at the same time, you feel that this is necessary. This is absolutely pertinent to what we're doing every single day. And one of the things that we'll be looking at a upcoming event, and one of the questions that I already have in my head was that, are informal meetings like the conference on the future of Europe, are they working, or are they too scripted? It is an attempt by the institutions to do these sort of outreach informally so that ordinary citizens could be heard. But at the same time, are they really working? Do they address the concerns, or we're just going through the motion and saying that, okay, we've reached out to citizens informally and that's it?
Yeah.
So it's very interesting for us to look at that. And I totally agree with you, Phil. I mean, there's so many talented communicators in the institutions, and who, they definitely know what to do. But as I've also been in DG Communications, I can tell you that the bureaucracy is just such a tough nut to crack. And like, and sometimes the people just feel like, okay, maybe I should just stop trying. And I really feel for them. I think the message that we need to bring, us, this group and everybody who's working in the bubbles on communicating, I think it's our role to tell the leaders in the institutions to say that, please, you are not reaching out to citizens, and this will only result in further fragmentation of our society. You need to buck up. It's not about you having to do whatever bureaucratic, sort of like processes anymore. It's really about preserving what we have, peace and unity, and that is so precious. That is so precious.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think it's as you said, it's critical to have these conversations. By the way, I think it's interesting because in Brussels, when you have these meetings, again, meetings and online discussions on LinkedIn or discussions like this, yes, it's a small group of people, but often you're like, oh, that person is running the campaign for this political party. This one is actually writing the next version of the GDPR legislation. So in a room of 20 people, you often have people who have incredible impact on the entire EU institutions. And I think we kind of forget that. And I noticed that when we do the EU influencer events, we had people like Paul Nemitz in the room who was working on GDPR. We had people who are, shaping discussions and sometimes they're doing it. They're not the face of the conversation, but they're the people who are behind them. So I first of all, I wholly agree with you. I think these conversations are important, but I think it's important to realize that you might be reaching people who have far more influence potentially than they even realize. That's the first point. The second thing is, all these people are both working in institutions and they're citizens. And I think what they need to think about is, okay, just forget about my hat as a person working the parliament and these institutions. What am I thinking about Europe as a citizen? And that's when you need to say, okay, why do I care? Apart from the fact I have a job in Brussels and that pays the bill. I care about the bigger European story. We need to go out and tell that story with enthusiasm, with innovation, etc. So I think these meetings are important. We are involved in the Vote Brussels initiative, which is to get people to vote in the local election. And very interesting moment we have with the European election, national election, and then later the local election. These are all three completely different things, and yet they're all about the fact that we are privileged to be in a democracy where every part of the institutions that we're voting for changes lives. And this is what we were discussing last week, which is the local elections are incredibly important in Belgium. If you can have a huge amount of impact on your local affairs, and then in Brussels, especially this audience, can shape the future of the European institutions. So I think what's important is to remind people, look, this really matters. And again, this election will set the tone for the next 4 or 5 years, and it will essentially determine whether the institutions start to crumble or kind of find a new energy and tell the story and do the work that they have to do. So I think we need to bring this very optimistic message, but that it's very challenging and that it's very easy to fail. I don't think we should underestimate the risk of failure and the risk of disconnect. We have a potential Trump presidency coming up. Russia looks like it's going to come back into Ukraine in a stronger wave. So if we don't face those issues, we're headed into a very dramatic decade. So now I'd like to move to the recommendations. So Harold, what are your recommendations for our viewers this week?
I'm not reading much nowadays, I have to admit, but I like to give a shout out to 2 media channels that I follow religiously. One is quite well known. EU Screens is a podcast produced by journalist James Kenter. I think most of you know him.
Shout out to James.
Yes. I think I'm personally very politically diverse in my viewpoints, so I don't always agree with him. But I think it's just so important to have an independent voice in the town. And I fully embrace independent media and also people who really feel that it's really important that we have diverse voices and have the courage to report on different opinions. I think that's great. The other one I like to give a shout out to is The Battleground, led by Natalie Sarkic-Todd. I think she's a wonderful editor. And The Battleground is also independent media. They cover issues that may not be widely debated or well known, but they're so important to the continued survival of our freedoms and our rights. So to have a channel like the Battleground there and point the direction to things that are probably not sexy enough to be reported by more mainstream channels, but yet are important and should not be allowed to grow into a bigger problem. I think hats off to both James and and Natalie for their independent media.
Yeah, and I think James is a great example of a journalist who's gone out and really told stories. He likes to pick controversial topics. But I think what's important, and that's also what makes me optimistic, is that in Brussels and in the EU bubble, we're still able to have discussions with people who completely disagree. And we haven't gone to the kind of cancellation culture and the state at which I believe the US has reached, where you just don't listen to the other person because they are pure evil. And so basically each side has decided that, no more conversation, they're corrupt and evil, we're the heroes. And so, what I feel in Brussels is that we might have deep disagreements, but we're still in agreement to the fact that we need to have conversations and that we're still looking for solutions. And there is a kind of underlying consensus about democracy, peace, prosperity that we're trying to get to through different paths. So I believe that this is still very, very much embedded in the culture. I hope that it stays this way, that we can have these really intense discussions, but we still maintain respect even for people that we deeply dislike and disagree with. Evie, what are your recommendations for us this week?
My recommendation for this week is a book that I recently read and I enjoyed very much. The name is The Life Brief, a playbook for no regrets living, and it's by Bonnie Van, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. And it basically serves as an essential playbook for achieving your aspirations. It's like a 3-step method that helps, like you, the reader, realign, your journey with your personal, professional, cultural, and spiritual dreams. And I think it's a good book to read after Atomic Habits, which we've spoke about a lot, like in this live. So check it out. I think it's a great addition in this type of, it's like a book genre. Oh my God.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. My recommendation this week is actually a book I haven't read, but I was listening to an interview by Jonathan Haidt called The Anxious Generation. And he's written a couple of books, The Coddling of the American Mind. And he was actually contributing to some research also on the outrage machine, which is fantastic. I read it. Now, this one is the one that says, the latest generation of teenagers has kind of been, traumatized or kind of severely hampered by mobile phones and social media. I heard his interview. I mean, I know the story because it's one that's told again. I don't fully agree with it. I mean, I think you need to look at it in a slightly wider frame, because it's very easy to just say, oh, mobile phones and social media, that's the problem. I think there are other problems that are connected, and I think we need to have a more open approach to this, but also I think we need to be aware of the toxicity of the way you can engage with platforms. So I think it's an excellent conversation to have. If you have kids or teenagers, I think it's very good to be conscious of the problems it creates, and the problems of comparison and all these other things, which I think have been there through media, through TV, through the star system, now on social media. So I think it's very good to go deep into this discussion. And he's now, I think, the talk of the town in terms of there's been a whole range of discussion around it. So that is my recommendation for this week. So with that, I think that's all we have time for. In theory, I believe there will be a very sunny weekend tomorrow, reaching 25 degrees in Brussels. But can we believe the weather reports? Because I wasn't convinced today. But anyway, as you said, Evie, fingers crossed, hopefully a beautiful weekend. Let's continue this conversation online. Looking forward to have you, Harold, and the network of Beer and Politics in our office, and that we continue this conversation and make democracy great again, as to paraphrase someone nobody wants to paraphrase. All right. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend and see you online. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.